Skeptic Zone, a miracle of technology. A universe of reason, the Skeptic Zone.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 678 for the 3rd of October, 2021. Richard Saunders coming to you from Sydney, Australia. October already. Well, it's been a long year, of course, and much of this year for Sydney-siders has been in lockdown. But it seems next week, certain restrictions will be lifted and we can start to look forward to getting back to life as normal, whatever that might mean in the future. But what's in the future for the next hour anyway? Coming up on the Skeptic Zone podcast, we're going to start off with a report from Adrian Hill. You can count on Adrian with Adrian Hill. She's going to be looking at the Herman Cain Award. And this is akin to the sorryantivaxxer.com site we discussed a couple of weeks ago. And apparently this is on subreddit. Find out more with Adrian Hill. Then we relate the story, which you've probably heard by now, about the strong stance YouTube is taking against anti-vaccination disinformation and banning many prominent anti-vaxxers and videos pertaining to vaccination giving bad or false advice. A strong move. Find out more later on in the show. Then a real treat. Maynard is back with Maynard's Spooky Action, and Maynard chats to his dad. Maynard's dad turned 93 a couple of weeks ago. Maynard took the opportunity to interview him about his memories of when he was a very young boy and the ramifications of the last flu pandemic. Then to round off the show, it's the Trove segment. This week we're going to be looking at palm reading. Palm reading in the annals of digitized newspapers going back through the decades. And speaking of palm reading is the subject of one of the very short videos I've just put up on TikTok. At Richard_Saunders on TikTok, I've put up palm reading, tarot card reading, and pendulums, because I've noticed all those sort of things do appear on TikTok. Have I noticed palm reading? I'm sure it's there somewhere. Certainly tarot card, as we discussed last week, and pendulums. And I hope to be putting up more short videos, probably in the next week. But if you go to the Skeptic Zone website at skepticzone.tv, go to the top of the page, you'll see the TikTok link, and you can check them out. And my dear friend Dr. Angie Matke over in Atlanta, Georgia, has also been putting up the same videos, and we're keen to see who gets more hits. Maybe I'm cheating a bit by mentioning my videos on the Skeptic Zone. TikTok is an interesting thing. It's light entertainment to all the way to very serious topics. Lots of silliness there. And lots of good information and bad information. It's a mixed bag. And another shout out to my wonderful friends in Melbourne. It's been too long. I keep dreaming of the day. Melbourne is a great place to visit. Wonderful place. I keep dreaming of the day where I'm able to go down to visit Melbourne. I have such a good time with my friend Dr. Steve Roberts in Melbourne. We have the habit in the recent years of raiding Costco to buy a giant tin of crunchy peanuts, a couple of bottles of red wine, a nice bottle of whiskey, and just enjoy watching obscure Russian movies. Yeah, it's good, and I really enjoy it. And to my other friends in Melbourne, I think you know how much I miss seeing you. Stay tuned at the end of the show for more announcements from me. But now it's time for me to run downstairs and have that wonderful, wonderful sourdough bread with a bit of cream cheese, some Swiss cheese on top of that, and mustard. Yeah. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. You can count on Adrian with Adrian Hill.
Hello everyone. Similar to the content of the sorryantivaxxer.com site that Richard, Susan Gerbic, and Rob Palmer talked about a couple episodes ago, there is a subreddit that has become very popular that I'm going to talk about today. Like the Sorry Anti-Vaxxer site, it is really difficult to read. It is called the Herman Cain Award subreddit, which awards the Herman Cain Freedom Award that has seen exponential growth according to several news sources writing about the sub. In July, there were around 2,000 members, and when I looked at the sub on September 22nd, when I found out about it, there were just under 280,000 members. As of today, when I'm recording on September 30th, there are just over 340,000 members. What is the Herman Cain Freedom Award, and who was Herman Cain? Herman Cain, according to Wikipedia, was a successful American businessman and Republican activist. In 2011, Cain announced his candidacy for president, though he did later withdraw after facing allegations of sexual misconduct. In 2020, Cain was the co-chair of Black Voices for Trump. He opposed mask mandates, posting anti-mask propaganda regularly on his social media accounts. An example of one of his tweets. Quote, "Don't believe everything you hear on fake news. I never had the Wuhan flu because it doesn't exist. Hashtag mask off, hashtag my body, my choice, hashtag plandemic." End quote. Cain was photographed at a June 2020 Trump rally not wearing a mask, surrounded by a crowd also not wearing masks. 9 days later, Cain tested positive for COVID-19, and of course we don't know for sure he contracted the virus at the rally. And sadly, he died a month later from COVID-19 complications. He was 74. The Herman Cain Freedom Award, or HCFA, is reminiscent of the Darwin Awards. Taken directly from the subreddit, it says, quote, "Nominees have made public declaration of their anti-mask, anti-vax, or COVID hoax views, followed by admission to hospital for COVID. The award is granted upon the nominees' release from their earthly shackles." End quote. The subreddit has been criticized as being insensitive and grotesque by appearing to celebrate the deaths of people that are not in the same political circle. And I don't know if the posts are checked for accuracy, but what I saw was a lot of very sad and frustrated people posting about friends and relatives that they miss and mourn for, sending a warning to others about the seriousness of the disease. Many have a very angry overtone because the deaths were preventable. According to Lil Louthborough, who wrote an opinion piece for Slate.com, she describes the site as cruel and heartless, but goes on to state it is one place where you truly see the suffering of these people in vast numbers versus a single anecdote. Starting with the person's angry rants and grandstanding about not getting vaccinated, not wearing masks, or conspiracy theories, followed by photographs and descriptions of the course of the disease that can be really brutal. The moderators have made it very clear that they would prefer that the sub didn't exist. They equate it to people gawking at a terrible, preventable accident on a freeway. As an example of what you might find, here are two of the top stories that I saw from September 22nd. Bearskin Rug wrote, quote, "Travis and Amber have 8 kids. Travis was in a car accident last year and is on long-term disability, with Amber being the breadwinner. She was afraid of the jab because of a, quote, bad reaction Travis had to a flu vaccine, end quote. She passed away last night due to COVID. 8 kids now motherless. Get vaccinated, end quote." 2777 wrote, quote, "Big John thought child sex trafficking was a bigger pandemic than COVID, refusing the vaccine and calling mask wearers sheep. He's my family, and he died," end quote. According to the moderators, one of the main hopes for the page is that it will encourage people to get vaccinated. While there are no numbers to indicate if this is effective, I was gratified to notice that there were alternating Herman Cain Freedom Awards posts and, quote, IPA posts when I looked at the site. An IPA is not an Indian Pale Ale Award for beer. It is the Immunized to Prevent Award that was created by the subreddit moderators. There were many posts of people showing their vaccine cards and stating that the subreddit was the reason for them changing their mind. Posted by Lovely Lady 227 on September 22nd, 2021, quote, "My extended family is all in the running based on their social media. This subreddit was what fully convinced me after waffling back and forth. Officially out of the running and so relieved, honestly." End quote. Posted by Max Brown, quote, "Kind of embarrassed it took me this long. Always been pro-vax, but just kept putting it off. No more." End quote. Tooth Hurty, love that name, posted their vaccination card stating they were declining their Herman Cain Award. And that is the most important thing to bring forward. It is easy to avoid getting this award. Just get vaccinated, wear a mask, and social distance. Until next time, this is Adrian Hill signing off and running upstairs to admire my vaccination passport that shows I am doing my best to avoid the Herman Cain Freedom Award as well.
You told me that aliens really exist. You met them and swooned with.
Sziasztok!
Halló!
Hejsan, hejsan!
Did you know the European continent is home to almost 750 million people living in 50 different countries, belonging to an even greater number of ethnicities?
And believe it or not, only a handful of them list English as the first or at least one of the official languages.
And there's an amazing amount of skeptical activism going on out there that you are not aware of because it's not in English.
Yeah, because you know, pseudoscience, quackery and fake news do not stop at borders. They get translated to other languages and transferred across the whole world.
So, if you're interested in weekly updates on what's going on in some of the countries here, providing you with all the interesting facts, news and even some skeptical history,
Or if you want to hear interviews in English with brilliant people you sometimes haven't even heard about,
then what you need is to subscribe to the ESP.
extrasensory perception. You must be really wrong.
no, the ESP as in
The European Skeptics Podcast.
That's right. And if you're wondering how you can find us online, go to theesp.eu.
And you can also find us on Twitter at espodcast_EU, or you can like us on Facebook.
And if you want to subscribe, do a quick search on all the intertubes for the European Skeptics Podcast. You'll find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify and all the rest.
The European Skeptics Podcast.
The real ESP experience.
I don't know how you can believe.
Now, here's a development that took me a little bit by surprise. It's a welcome development, of course, and this is reported at the ABC News Service here in Australia, abc.net.au. I'll link to this story in the show note, but the story is from Reuters. YouTube blocks all anti-vaccine content. And this was published on the 30th of September. YouTube will block all anti-vaccine content, moving beyond its ban on false information about COVID vaccines to include content that contains misinformation about other approved vaccines, it has said in a blog post. Examples of content that won't be allowed on YouTube include claims that the flu vaccine causes infertility, that the MMR shot, which protects against measles, mumps and rubella, can cause autism, according to YouTube's policies. The online video company, owned by Alphabet Inc., is also banning channels associated with several prominent anti-vaccination activists, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Joseph McCullough, a YouTube spokesman said. A press email for McCullough's website said in a statement, quote, "We are united across the world. We will not live in fear. We will stand together and restore our freedoms." End quote. Mr. Kennedy said in a statement, quote, "There is no instance in history when censorship and secrecy have advanced either democracy or public health." End quote. The move comes as YouTube and other tech giants like Facebook Inc. and Twitter Inc. have been criticized for not doing enough to stop the spread of false health information on their sites. But even as YouTube takes a tougher stand on misinformation, it faces backlash around the world. On Tuesday, Russian state-backed broadcaster RT's German-language channels were deleted from YouTube, as the company said the channels had breached its COVID-19 misinformation policy. Russia on Wednesday called the move, quote, unprecedented information aggression, end quote, and threatened to block YouTube. Now, this has just triggered in my mind the interesting situation where we have people marching in the street for freedom, so to speak, echoing and regurgitating what we know to be false information, outright lies, distorted facts, and all the rest of it. And they are quick to call the rest of us sheep or sheeple, or accuse us of not doing our own research, and so on and so forth. It's interesting because the exact criticisms they level at us fit them far better, without question. It's fascinating from a psychological point of view. And it reminds me too of a recent series of posts that I was involved with somebody who was upset that there is a strong movement now against anti-vaxxers, citing lots of anecdotal evidence for the harm vaccine cause, and when pressed, simply could not come up with the goods. And I saw a TikToker commenting, saying that when the anti-vaxxers, they scream and cry and carry on, but if they're forced into court, they can't back up their stance with evidence. Much like the analogy was made, much like Rudy Giuliani and the big lie controversy. Once they've actually been placed in court and need to back up their bold statements, of course, their side falls apart. Anyway, 3 cheers for YouTube for banning damaging and harmful false information.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is a podcast.
Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon. She says she's the devil himself.
That thing is not my daughter. And I want you to tell me there's a show where the hosts don't just report on fringe science and spirituality, but take part themselves.
Well, there is, and it's Oh No, Ross and Carrie on Maximum Fun.
This year, we actually became certified exorcists.
So yes, Carrie and I can help your daughter.
Or we can just talk about it on the show.
Oh No, Ross and Carrie on MaximumFun.org.
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
Now, Richard is doing something very special on the Skeptic Zone. He was talking about Newcastle, and he was talking about the 1918 flu, the 1918 pandemic, which I believe went round the world a couple of times, as far as, 1922 in some places. And, of course, here's someone who wasn't exactly there, but they weren't very far from it. It's my dad, who is 93 years old today. Happy birthday, Dad.
Thank you.
Hey, what did you hear about as a child growing up about the Great Plague that happened only a few years before you were born?
Well, there was a plague before the flu epidemic. They tracked it back to the rats and the mice and all that type of vermin. But that was quite severe, particularly when you look at it those days, the medical knowledge was not what it is today. But of course, after the plague came the flu, which was an aftermath of the First World War. And what I've read about it, that mostly came from America, where the American soldiers came over towards the First World War, getting towards the end of it. and it tracked around there, and of course after the First World War it made its way back home to Australia.
And were any family members affected? Were there anybody working as medical staff at that time that you know of? Was there any personal history involved?
Not that I can remember, but my uncle, he went to the First World War, but he was in France in the trenches, but he escaped and came back home again. Uncle Ted he was, but he didn't bring it back home. But it found its way back home here, and everything I've read, the history books, tell us it more or less came from the end of the First World War, but it came there by the Americans, which came in towards the end of the First World War, and then the disease was automatically in some way found its way back to Australia, which was very, very severe. In Wallsend, where I lived, my mother recalls it very well, and the only thing I can remember telling me that the Wallsend Public School was turned into a hospital to meet the demands for the people that were stricken with this very bad flu epidemic, and of course a lot of people lost their lives with it.
And can you remember anybody wearing masks after that? Was there any mask wearing going on when you were young as like a sort of memory of that time, wearing masks as a precaution?
No, I can't comment on that one because I'm not sure. But there's no doubt the wearing of masks at the present moment with the present epidemic we've got with COVID, I'm hearing the reports, they'll take at the moment, Singapore, they're seriously considering that masks will be there to stay for good. But on my many visits, I recall all the many times I went to Hong Kong back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Every time we went there, I was quite surprised to see people in Hong Kong wearing masks. And I automatically thought, oh, well, they must be sick or something. But that's not it at all. The reason that they mostly wear masks back in Hong Kong is because they don't want to catch the local flu or the local health problems that's there. And so this will be probably the reason that, who knows, we may have to continue wearing masks, which will give you an added protection in relation to your health.
Of course, there's been a few other various diseases that have come along that have been of note. There has been the Hong Kong flu in the 60s. There's been polio, of course, which was like unknown now, but was around in the 50s and before. Is there any disease like that that's affected people you know throughout your life?
No, it's never ever been publicised. But let's face it. If you're wearing a mask, well, definitely you got more protection than picking up the local cold or flu or whatever bugs going around at the moment. So those people in the order have been there a long time, and they've been using this pattern for quite a number of years, even though it's quite a healthy location.
Can you remember the first time you heard or were exposed or offered a vaccination of some sort? A shot to protect you from something. When was the first time you can remember maybe being aware of that?
Well, measles was one. Measles was a moment. It was the one that you were vaccinated, and I don't know whether that's a vaccination today, a strong one. So yeah, it's still wrong. So the wearing of masks has definitely been proven. You can look after your health a bit better.
And at 93, you wouldn't be saying no to the vaccine at all. You've had your shot. You've had both your shots, haven't you?
I've got in the queue as long as I possibly can. And I advise everybody else to get vaccinated.
And one last question. Being 93, not very often I get to talk to my dad alone. Look, what's the biggest change you can think of or see, positive or negative, in the whole 93 years?
Well, I think the biggest change, and I've spoke about this on many, many occasions, and I'd like to give you a list one day of exactly what I've seen. But possibly the main change that we had to do right through our life was live within your means. If you bought a house, you could only borrow to the value of 5 times of what your yearly income was. And you had to live within your means and budget accordingly. If you didn't have a car, or if you didn't have a refrigerator, a big boom was in when the wireless come in. And I think the wireless, back in my days, I can remember Dad saying we paid £5.10 for it. And lay-bys. If you wanted anything, you had to lay-by it and pay it off and then go and pick it up. These days, I think that the credit card system has blown everything out of proportion, where people use the card, run up the debt, and then all of a sudden they find out they've got to pay for it. And you could go on with all the rapid changes, but the main thing to answer your question is this: in our day and growing up, live within your means and buy it when you can afford it.
Happy 93rd birthday, Dad.
Hallo aan alle Nederlandse luisteraars. Op dit moment bent u aan het luisteren naar de Skeptic Zone, voor wetenschap en kritisch nadenken. Voor meer informatie ga naar www.skepticzone.tv.
Time once again to look into the pages of Trove at trove.nla.gov.au, the online resource from the Australian Government and the National Library of Australia. Digitized newspapers and reports and gazettes and that sort of thing. Also, we'll be looking further afield too this week, combining some newspapers from the United States. And this week I thought we would look at the subject of palm reading, or palmistry, or chiromancy. Palm reading has been around, of course, for, millennia. And I seem to remember there was a fad for it when I was a kid in the schoolyard for a little while. Well, it's a classic of reading, future fortune-telling, that sort of thing. Like looking into the crystal ball, reading the tea leaves. You can sort of lump it in with that sort of gypsy fortune tellers and that sort of imagery. And palm reading seems to be a little bit more personal because the palm reader is looking directly at your hand. So I think you can see that there could be a feeling of a greater connection there. A better connection maybe than looking at the stars. Now, before we start looking into the archives, let's see what it says over at the Skeptics Dictionary at skepdic.com on the subject of palmistry. Here it is. Palmistry, also known as chiromancy, is the practice of telling fortunes from the lines, marks, and patterns on the hands, particularly the palms. Palmistry was practiced in many ancient cultures such as India, China, and Egypt. The first book on the subject appeared in the 15th century. The term chiromancy comes from the Greek word for hand. Palmistry was used in the Middle Ages to detect witches. It was believed that certain spots on the hand indicated one had had a pact with the devil. Palmistry was condemned by the Catholic Church, but in the 17th century it was taught at several German universities. Britain outlawed palmistry in the 18th century. It is popular enough in America in the 20th century to deserve its own book in the Complete Idiot's Guide series. According to Anne Fiery, the Book of Divination, if you are right-handed, your left hand indicates inherited personality traits, and your right hand indicates your individuality and fulfillment of potential. The palmists claim to be able to read the various lines in your hand. These lines are given names like lifeline, the heart line, the headline, the Saturn line. The lifeline supposedly indicates physical vitality, the headline intellectual capacity, the heart line emotional nature, etc. He goes on to say the authors of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Palmistry, Robin Giles and Lisa Leonard, claim that palmistry works because your hand changes as you do. They claim to have a few anecdotes to back them up on this, but fail to produce any scientific support for the claim. And there's more information there worth a read. Now let's have a look and do a search for palmistry in the news archives, and we land in the year 1925 on the 13th of June from News, which was published in Adelaide, South Australia. Costly palm reading. Brisbane today. Why the teller of the commercial bank, Bundaberg, was paying out cash from a bundle of notes to a strange woman yesterday, he was persuaded by her to have his palm read. Shortly afterward, the teller discovered that a bundle of notes to the value of £50 was missing. The police were communicated with and a search was made, but no one was arrested. It is alleged that a woman was searched and found to be in possession of a sum of money, but the notes could not be identified by the teller because the numbers were not known. That's an interesting story. Distract a bank teller by reading his palm. And now we come to a story from 1929, the 4th of June, in the Labour Daily from Sydney, Australia. Do women love the occult? American report. Girls take more stock in fortune-telling than boys, whether of the teacup, palm reading, or playing card variety, according to a report made in the Journal of Abnormal and Societal Psychology. The greater credulity of the so-called weaker sex showed up in tests with some 6,000 schoolchildren made by Dr. Harvard Lehman and Paul A. Whitty of Ohio University and the University of Kansas. Girls of all ages took greater interest in dabbling in the occult than boys, the peak being reached at around the age of 13 years. Boys tend to outgrow their superstitious leanings as they approach manhood, but girls do not, the investigators found. They suggest that this state of affairs may be due to the greater importance of emotions in the life of women, and also to the restricted range of feminine activities. These forces, it was stated, may cause women to fall back on superstition for guidance more frequently than men. And now from 1933, on the 16th of March, from the Daily News, Perth, Western Australia. Could not see into future. Fortune tellers ban. Melbourne, Thursday. Because such an unromantic thing as a full court decision has made fortune-telling illegal, a general meeting of city cafe proprietors decided to discontinue immediately all teacup and palm reading. This will mean the dismissal of a large number of employees in Melbourne tea rooms and cafes. The ban, which took effect yesterday, had far-reaching effects. One large cafe had to turn away close to 200 women who sought to have their cups or palms read. The decision affects cafe seers of all descriptions: palmists, phrenologists, crystal gazers, and teacup readers. A poignant feature is that none of these could foretell that the ban was going to be imposed. Now let's head across the ocean to the United States. The Plymouth News, dated the 25th of September 1913. Seem to need explanation. Authenticated facts as to palmistry may hardly be dismissed as nonsense. You, being a typical hard-headed specimen of humanity, have often expressed yourself as taking not the slightest stock in palmistry and all that kind of rot, and have openly jeered at feeble-minded men who openly admit that they, quote, can't help but believe there is something to it, end quote. Utter nonsense. Of course it's nonsense. And yet, how do you explain some of the striking and verified instances on record of the fulfillment of the future as foretold by the hands? Take the following authentic case as an example. About 4 years ago, 2 women of refinement, more from a spirit of diversion than any other reason, determined to consult a well-known palmist in London. The first woman was thunderstruck by the accurate reading given to her past. She was promised a happy future also, and the palmist foretold many events which have since come true. The past of the second woman was read also, but the palmist refrained from saying anything about her future. When asked why she did not prophesy in regard to this, she replied, "I can see no future in your hand." Barely 10 minutes afterwards, the woman whose hand portrayed no future was run over and killed by a motor omnibus when crossing the Strand. Quite recently, a skeptic, in regard to palmistry, was induced to consult a famous palmist. He did so in a spirit of derision, but his attitude soon changed to one of awed surprise. The palmist detailed events in his life which were known to himself alone. He had spent 10 years of his youth in America. There he had married unhappily and divorced his wife. When he returned to England, he determined to look upon that part of his life as a closed book, and so his friends over here, without exception, were ignorant of the fact that he had ever married. The palmist not only read about his marriage in his hands, but gave the exact year in which it took place, the events which led up to it, and those which led to its dissolution. After this striking demonstration of the art of palmistry, the skeptic was constrained to admit that there was a great deal in it after all. And I think, apart from anything else here, we've got a couple of situations. It's the classic story of somebody who says, "I'm a skeptic," without realizing what that entails or really means. In other words, it's all very well to say, for example, "I'm a skeptic of palm reading, I don't believe in it," and when you have no understanding of, well, basically cold reading and patter and the psychology behind it, well, you can quite easily be wowed. We also have the situation, of course, of stories being told, as in the 2 women who had their futures read and one was killed. We have no idea if that happened at all, and if it did happen, what parts of it really did happen, what were true, what was not. We just have no idea. But it makes for a good story. Now we turn to the Braidwood Review and District Advocate from New South Wales, dated the 22nd of October 1940. Fortune-telling condemned. Insult to God. Spiritualism, fortune-telling, omens, charms, and astrology were condemned by the Reverend Francis A. Wallace, C.SSR, in a lunch-hour address at St. Mary's Cathedral. Fortune-telling, card-cutting, and cup and palm reading, he said, began in jest and ended seriously. God alone could tell the future. If fortune-tellers could tell the future, they did so by the power of the devil. I'll just stop here and say, hang on a second, didn't he just say that God alone could tell the future? Let's read on. What an insult to God! Astrology, a craze amongst many Australians, made one doubt the mentality of those who followed it. Certain newspapers and radio broadcasting stations were furthering this ridiculous and dangerous custom. Stupid people gave up their hard-earned money to be told about the future. Soft-brained people had been fleeced of their money by believing in the stars. There were warnings in the sacred scriptures against soothsayers. If the horse of which some people dreamt did not win the Melbourne Cup, they were tremendously disappointed. The Melbourne Cup, of course, being a very famous horse race here in Australia. Spiritualistic seances served the devil. Mediums became insane because they became possessed of the devil, from whom they had their origin. Ooh, that's a dire warning way back in 1940. And there we'll leave the reports for this week. Yes, palm reading is one of those good old-fashioned sorts of fortune-telling, like gazing into the crystal ball or astrology, or it's something that comes to your mind when you think about fortune tellers and that sort of thing. But certainly worth a visit into the digital archives to see what was reported. And you too can spend many happy hours wandering the digital corridors of Trove at trove.nla.gov.au. Run a search and you'll never know what you'll find. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Now, don't forget Skepticon, the Australian Skeptics annual convention, this year being held in conjunction with the New Zealand Skeptics, will be happening in November, late November. For all the information and to register your interest, which I recommend you do, and you can find out more, go to skepticon.org.au. I'll put a link in this week's show notes. It says the Australian and New Zealand Skeptics Joint Annual Convention. Every year, skeptics in Australia and New Zealand hold their separate annual conventions. This year will be different. The two groups are joining hands across the water by holding a joint event. Speakers in both countries and elsewhere around the world. And you can see a list of some of the speakers coming up, including keynotes Dr. Richard Wiseman from the UK and Susie Wiles from New Zealand. Dr. Susie Wiles, of course, who was recently the New Zealander of the Year. It's very exciting to help get ready for that, and that will be on the 20th to the 21st of November. Head to skepticon.org.au to find out more, and you can register your interest. Hope to see you there, one way or another. Thank you to all those people who continue to support the Skeptic Zone at skepticzone.tv via Patreon or PayPal. October already. I like the first week of any given month, because that's when the money from Patreon comes into my account, and I can use that to pay the Skeptic Zone bills and just pay bills in general, believe it or not. And your contribution, as I always say, makes the show possible. So thank you to those people who do chip in every week or every month via Patreon or PayPal. And if you could all do me a favor, if you find the show enjoyable, interesting, you get a laugh out of it, it's part of your daily routine or weekly routine, tell your friends, listen to the Skeptic Zone and you can hear Trove or Maynard or Adrian or the Skeptical Fairy or no end of things. I would appreciate it. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Well, we've been having a really, really productive morning, folks, at the Great Australian Psychic Prediction Project. I've got the scragglers here because we've spent the best part of 3 hours pouring through predictions, and we were just looking at events in the year 2005 that weren't predicted, including the Pope dying, a prominent politician in Australia resigning, Cyclone Katrina, and other things. I'm with Adrian Hill. Hello, Adrian.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Rob Palmer, the well-known skeptic.
How are you?
And Michelle Bickersmar. Hello, Michelle.
Hello, everyone. And Richard.
You're not shaking in your seat this week.
Not this time, although just shaking with anticipation because my numbers are going to come up.
Oh, your number. Before we get to your numbers, Michelle, Rob, we heard you earlier in the Skeptic Zone. You're going to be interviewing, of course, John Delancey from Star Trek. That's exciting.
Oh, I am jazzed about it. Yes, I interviewed him for Skeptical Inquirer and my column before he spoke at SciCon 2019, and that was a great opportunity to get to interview him then. And this time I get to do it live.
Wow, that's I really like him as an actor. I think he's great. And did you ever hear the series he did with Leonard Nimoy called Alien Voices?
I know about it, but no, I've never looked it up, and I really should do that.
I enjoyed that. I bought those years ago when they came out. They did Spock versus Q, which is a lot of fun, and they also did Jules Verne's. They did some recordings of Jules Verne's work, dramatizations. Look it up, folks.
Yes, so
it's called
speaking
Alien
of him
Voices.
and Leonard Nimoy, of course, Leonard Nimoy famously felt he was typecast as Spock and wrote the book I Am Not Spock, which I have, and then later decided I am Spock and wrote that book.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask John if he ever felt like that at all regarding his Q role. Probably not, because he's had so many roles and everything.
No, and I enjoyed his work in the recent Star Trek Continues series where he played a different character.
And I can't wait to see him on Picard. Picard season 2 is going to be Q all the time.
All right, so we're going to play the dice game, folks. We haven't played it. I don't think we played it last week. I've got a 6-sided one, just a classic this time. What do I hear, folks? What do you predict?
6.
6? Rob?
6.
Oh, Michelle, 6 too. 666. And for Susan's sake, I'm going to say 5. So here's the first roll. Here it comes. Oh, you're going to kill me. You're all going to kill me. It's 5.
Whoa, Susan was right, even though she's not here.
Susan's not here. She's going to die. All right, next one. Any change, or do you still want to stick with 6?
3.
4.
6.
All right. 6.
Hey, see, I predicted earlier my numbers were going to come up and I was shaking with anticipation.
What was the magnitude of the earthquake? What was the first number? I'll pick that number.
5.9, I think.
All right, so I'll go with 5 this time.
I'll go with 6 again.
And Michelle?
And I'm going to round out that 5.9 to a 6.
All right, here it comes. Wow, it's 2. So there you go, folks. Today's winning numbers are 5, 6, and 2. And of course, we'll do the supplementary. So one more roll in case. What do I hear?
Let's go for 1.
1?
I'll go for 6.
6?
I think I'll have a change then for the supplementary and go for a 3.
A 3. Here it comes. 2.
It's amazing, Richard. Every single time I do this, when I'm just listening to the podcast, I get them all right. And whenever you record me, I never get one right, ever.
Sure.
It's amazing.
Thanks, everyone. How do I stop the recording?
Up at the top, I believe there's a little button there saying